We're lucky because President Trump's still alive. God blessed America by keeping President Trump alive. And I don't want to imagine what this world looks like right now if he hadn't turned his head.
Rick, Mary and I were talking about that today. We were out in our gazebo as we start every morning and thinking if that bullet had been just a half inch, or if he had turned his head a half inch later than what he did, that bullet would have not nipped his ear. It would have hit him in the head. And we're going to have Dr. Stephen Soloway is actually a friend of Donald Trump to join us to talk about exactly that. What kind of what that bullet would have been done without what a lot of people are calling divine intervention. And Rick, at 6:10 on Saturday evening, a shot rang out, and I think changed our world forever, changed our country, changed the future of our country. Tragically, one person did die, a man did die, a couple others were wounded. Donald Trump was wounded, and Rick, when you think of all the places that you could be wounded, the nip of your ear is probably the least tragic place, but it could have been a whole lot worse. And then we have Joe Biden coming out over the weekend calling for unity, and I want to call on Joe Biden, if you really want unity, if you really want to end vitriol, what you should do is open the jail doors of those J6 prisoners, President Biden, or let those people go. If you want unity, this is the way to show it. And then, of course, today the Republican convention starts. J.D. Vance has been picked as Donald Trump's running mate. There was a court ruling in Florida that went against this guy, Stephen Smith, and in some cases, we're going to have Paul Kaminer join us to talk about that. We're also going to have Charles Marino, a former executive with the Secret Service, talk about the Secret Service response and Secret Service, how it may really be in trouble. And wow, Rick, where do we go? Where do we begin?
Just what I know is anybody who's interested in what's happening right now needs to stay tuned, because we have the right guests to really talk about it from an expert point of view and have some ideas of our own in terms of what needs to be examined. But a piece of this that I think is almost strangely being moved off the news is J.D. Vance from Ohio being named the vice presidential nominee.
Made my day. That made me, Rick, I've been saying all along, number one, we need a real strong conservative. Why? Because President Trump, if reelected, can only serve 4 years. We need a real strong conservative to follow in his footsteps, to pick up the mantle. Great. He's only 39 years old, a really young man, relatively speaking, for president. I'm elated about the pick. I didn't want Tim Scott, that's for sure. Why no Tim Scott? Because he voted along with Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer 80% or 20% of the time. He was no conservative. I didn't want Marco Rubio. I don't see Marco Rubio as a strong conservative. He's done some good things, but strong conservative? No. I like Doug Burgum, but I didn't see him picking up the mantle in 4 years. The other guy, your governor, Glenn Youngkin, was being mentioned, and I thought he wouldn't be too bad. But the guy I wanted was J.D. Vance, and that's who we got.
Yeah, most people don't know who J.D. Vance is. And the fact of the matter is he's only been in elected office for 2 years. He was elected to the U.S. Senate and from Ohio, won by a reasonable margin in an open seat. He is a guy who has been in alignment with Trump certainly on his trade policy, on his skepticism towards China, on his skepticism towards let's just write a check and keep Zelensky in furs approach, and wants accountability for how the money is being spent in the foreign policy field, and has fought for that. So he's somebody who has not been afraid to rustle some feathers up and say, we need to take a hard look at what's going on. Strong advocate for Israel. And I think he's young and he's learning. He's a self-made millionaire. He grew up as a poor kid and ended up making his way to Yale Law School. So he is a kid who grew up in meager circumstances and rose out of those circumstances to be pretty wealthy as he was in the tech industry and made a lot of money in the tech industry. before he turned his eye to politics and tried to make a difference in the world. J.D. Vance he's not doing it because he's always wished to be president of the United States. He's doing it because he looked around as a guy who was making money in the tech industry and said, where can I help? And he said, I'm going to run for Senate. Nobody expects me to win. Nobody knows who I am, but I'm going to run for the Senate. He won the primary, a hotly contested primary, and he's now the vice presidential nominee. Donald Trump picked his successor, and it's J.D. Vance.
And Rick, of course, we've got the shooting we're going to talk about. And Rick, I want to share my screen with you. Because are there any real coincidences in life anymore? And I'm a little bit skeptical about real coincidences. Laura Lomer, investigative reporter, I guess she was tipped off to this. A wonderful job of showing this shooter in an ad that was shot in a Pittsburgh area high school a couple of years ago when the shooter went there. And I just think it is amazing, the irony of it all. The ad was done by BlackRock, friends of the Obamas. This kid was featured in this ad. So what I wanted to do, Rick, I wanted to share my screen with you. And I want to show you the video. Now I'm going to show it without audio so we can talk over it. And I want to identify for you and our viewers Thomas, the shooter, in this video. All right, Rick. So I'm going to start the video, and I'll probably start I'll probably stop in the middle. This is see the student right here in front of the teacher. There he is. There is the shooter. How miraculous that this kid was featured in an ad. And the ad again was for BlackRock. And apparently BlackRock invests money for teachers and takes care of their retirement fund.
They invest a lot of the teacher pensions. And so this is an ad trying to reestablish their credibility after taking a pounding because of their allegiance with China and really concerns about BlackRock being behind all the diversity training and diversity, equity, inclusion process that's been pushed on this country, which we'll talk about a little bit later when we talk about the Secret Service. All right, but BlackRock was behind a lot of that, and so this is an ad trying to.
All right, there, Bethel Park High School.
That's the high school.
That's the high school, Bethel Park High School. And again, I'm going to stop the video again in a moment because the same student is shown again. There he is. There he is. And when someone first told me about this ad, a good friend of mine, John Minella, told me about this ad. I says, come on, buddy, what are the chances of that? Is it the same kid? Is it the same kid? I don't know, Rick. Let's look at this kid. Is this the same kid that we saw in the ad?
Sure looks like it.
To me, it is. This is a front view, and the other is a profile, but this is the same kid we saw in the ad.
Yep.
And Rick, I'm not showing, but I saw a very gruesome picture of this individual laying on a rooftop in Butler, Pennsylvania, with blood all over his face. And it is the same kid. It is Thomas Matthew Crooks.
Yes,
Rick,
it is. And I'm with you. I don't really believe in coincidences, and there's I've seen some stuff online that are drawing a lot of conclusions. What I do know is this. It's certainly interesting that this kid shows up in such a high-profile piece, an ad, and it's particularly since apparently the FBI is having a hard time finding his social media presence.
You know what amazes me, Rick? The FBI can't get into this kid's cell phone, and that brings up questions. The FBI can't get into the cell phone of a 20-year-old?
Into a cell phone, and when they're trying to determine whether or not he was working with somebody else. Supposedly, they can't get into his cell phone. They can't find social media. They can't find any of the normal markers you would see. They didn't have a laptop, didn't have a tablet. And so it's pretty, let's face it, pretty hard to imagine that this kid was in fact completely void of social media presence. And the FBI has not acquitted itself well on these kind of investigations. I'll remind the viewers and listeners about the congressional baseball practice where a deranged Bernie Sanders supporter drove across 4 states and had lots of rifles and explosives, and with a list of Republican congressmen, asked somebody if the Republicans were practicing over there, was told yes, went over and started shooting and almost killed Steve Scalise, the majority leader. And the FBI, after investigating that, the only reason he didn't kill 13 to 15 members of Congress was because Steve Scalise was there, and as majority leader, he had service. He had Capitol Police protection. Otherwise, there would have been no Capitol Police on that ball field, and it would have been a killing field. And yet the FBI, after doing the investigation, decided, even with all the evidence that he was a Bernie Sanders supporter and crazy Bernie Sanders supporter, after all the evidence, they said their final conclusion was, oh, this was death by cops, okay? Come on. And so the Congress just beat the heck out of the FBI and they changed their conclusion. But given the fact that the FBI DC headquarters came up with somebody who clearly was trying to murder Republican members of Congress as death by cop is the conclusion and not a terrorist act, I don't know. I'd like to believe that they're looking into things, but let's just be clear. They don't have a great track record recently.
Hey, Rick, let's get a break in here. We do have 3 great guests joining us here on the Conservative Commandos with the Ricks, Rick Manning and yours truly, Rick Trader, coming to you from the MyPillow Studios and MyStore Studios of the AUN TV network. And never forget this, that today's show, like every single one of our shows, is being brought to you by the First Amendment, protected by the Second.